Well, it's been a while, hasn't it? After the last video, I've gone through various jobs, all while working on an overly ambitious video game by myself because I always put too much on my plate. So as you can imagine, my mental health has been pretty strained.
You fool, for I have a fun knee. You can't have one!
You might have noticed a theme with how I have covered games in recent years. I take a look with how a series starts, get a sense of the design philosophy, see how that evolves or changes from game to game, and assess what larger connections can be drawn from that.
But where's Nintendo?
Nintendo are notoriously weird with their sequels. Some series will be a big deal for a couple of console generations, then will either disappear for decades on end, or appear sporadically whenever they can think of a gimmick to justify its existence. With others, they will carbon copy them to the point where any life is sucked out of them. That's not to say that a more iterative approach can never be a good thing. It definitely can, but they can be pretty bad about when and where they apply it. They kind of occupy both extremes of the spectrum, with very little in between, and this can be frustrating if you enjoy one of their properties that gets left in the ether. Eternal darkness, my beloved. When the subject arises, two in particular tend to be brought up: Star Fox and F-Zero. In many ways, the two parallel each other. Both occupy more arcade-oriented genres, started their life on the Super Nintendo as technical showcases, then as the years went on, releases became sparse at best. However, despite that, F-Zero is a lot more straightforward. The games are fundamentally not that different from each other, with the biggest divide being the jump from Mode 7 pseudo 3D to actual polygonal 3D. They reached peak actualization with F-Zero GX, and the series just kinda stopped there. I can actually respect that. Star Fox, on the other hand, even on surface level, is a lot more sporadic and all over the place. So, of course, that's the one I'm going to be looking at today. What drove these constant shifts? What does that say about how Nintendo handles sequels? And how have they been impacted by the changes in how we, the public, perceive the medium itself? Let's find out. Star Fox for the Super Nintendo is, get this, a good game. Whoa, slow down there. It's an arcade-style rail shooter with polygonal 3D graphics. Now, in a broader sense, none of this was anything new. Gameplay-wise, we've had games like this since the early 1980s. Hell, as early as 1982, Sega released Zoom 909, which was renamed Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom for its Western release. And as the years went on, they released many more games of this ilk, like Space Harrier, Afterburner, Galaxy Force, and so on. In 1983, we not only had the first Atari Vector Star Wars arcade game, but they also put out iRobot, which used flat-shaded polygonal graphics and gameplay that alternated between an arcade platformer and a rail shooter. We also had Laserdisc games occupying this space, like Mach 3, Us vs. Them, and in the late 80s, Namco decided that they clearly weren't crazy enough, so combined a Laserdisc-based rail shooter with a ride in the form of Galaxian 3 Project Dragoon. The gameplay in question would be iterated upon in polygonal form with Starblade, which, as it turns out, was one of Star Fox's key inspirations. As for polygonal graphics, there's the aforementioned iRobot, but in the home there were more often found in computer games, from Sylpheed for MSX and DOS, Stunt Car Racer on the 8-bit micros like the Commodore 64, Hunter on the Atari ST, and many on the Amiga, including Virus, Frontier, and the work of a studio named Argonaut Software. While their first Starglider game had visuals more closely following the vectors of Star Wars, Starglider 2 gave us full polygonal flight combat. On consoles, 3D was more of a struggle. It wasn't non-existent, but hardly ever ideal. The Genesis used the Motorola 68000, the same chip as the Atari ST and Amiga. And while the system itself was clocked faster than the Super Nintendo, it was lacking in many other hardware features like scaling, hardware rotation, etc. The Super Nintendo, on the other hand, had many of those features, but ran off of a custom version of an enhanced version of the MOS 6502 chip. The original version of that chip was used in the likes of the NES, Commodore 64, and Atari 2600. So unless you got a crazy Commodore 64 coder like Manfred Trends, the frame rate in Super Nintendo games would often tank if you threw too much at the thing. So it appears that the solution to getting 3D polygonal gaming at a playable frame rate would be to either augment the hardware or get an impressive European software house off the microcomputers and in on the console action. Or hey, you could do both. Nintendo brought on Starglider developers Argonaut Software to co-develop Star Fox. Argonaut would also create the famed Super FX chip through enlisting external hardware engineers, including one Ben Cheese. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because he was one of the principal minds of Flare Technology, a team of ex-Sinclair research employees who produced the Flare 1, which was initially picked up by Welsh joystick manufacturer Connex for the Connex Multisystem.
The Connex Multisystem. It's a car, it's a plane, it's a bike, in one system. For other combat games, there are fire buttons placed in just the right position. The TV is mounted on the chair too, so it moves as you move. And all games are on standard 3.5-inch disc drive for real cost effectiveness.
Floppy disks on a system designed for use on a motion-based chair? Yes, very safe. I'm sure those floppies will be just fine. Unfortunately for me, because I need this madness in my life, Connex ran out of money. Flare's Flare 1 then became the basis for the cancelled Atari Panther, and the Flare 2 became the basis for the Atari Jaguar.
Well, at least something came out of it.
So this game being a technical marvel on the Super Nintendo kinda goes without saying at this point. Yes, the game runs at 20 FPS, but this is a console that's notorious for not even being able to handle 2D spaceship shooters without absolutely tanking, and here it is, handling a full 3D one at a consistent frame rate. I think what sums it all up is this. The gameplay itself may not be innovative or revolutionary, and this may not be the first game to ever use polygonal graphics, but it's all really, and I mean really well done and highly impressive in execution. I think it's also worth mentioning how Argonaut and Nintendo's approaches complemented each other here. Not long after this game, Argonaut released Vortex on the Super Nintendo, another Super FX game that's more ambitious and even more technically impressive than Star Fox, but also a lot jankier and harder to get into. Looking at their games, you can get a sense of what each party brought to the table, and it really works out here. Beyond that though, putting the technical achievement aside, I think this is just a good entry-level rail shooter, and that can be a very tricky balance to hit. In this kind of game, your means of interaction are to dodge and shoot. So in order to make a good one, you want your players to be reasonably active with their inputs. The last thing you want to do is make a game where you can put the controller down and watch as the game beats itself. However, it can be tricky to do that while also keeping it approachable. A lot of rail shooters get around this by either prioritizing spectacle to compensate for the lack of difficulty, or simply adhering to the mantra of get good. There are difficulty options in the form of a map screen, but even on easy, the game will demand you engage with the level design while also not making it super overwhelming. This also ensures that no matter what setting you pick, the game remains fun. Yeah, the frame rate can initially be off-putting when looking back at this through a modern lens, but honestly, it's really not that hard to get to grips with here, or at least I never found it to be. If you've been discouraged to really give this one a try just by looking at footage online, I'd honestly give it a solid recommendation. In terms of favorite Super Nintendo games, I wouldn't rank this anywhere near Super Mario World or Super Turrican, but this is a damn solid title and worth the playthrough. Up next, we have Star Fox 2, a pretty dramatic departure from the first game and one with quite the story to tell, albeit a very familiar one. This game was finished but unreleased during the Super Nintendo's commercial life, a decision that bewildered people for decades until Nintendo released the game for the Super Nintendo Classic Mini in 2017. Granted, the ROM was already leaked online well before that, but anywho...
I would posit that Nintendo downloaded Super Mario Bros. From the internet and sold it back to you.
The stages in this one are largely free-roaming, albeit in condensed bite-sized bursts. Stitching them together is a map screen that, instead of just being a difficulty select, forms sort of an arcadey take on real-time strategy. The game also introduces multiple playable characters and rival battles in the form of Starwolf encounters. This all seems to be well and good. However, a lot of it can feel like it ends before it begins. You're being flung from these different quick scenario types so frequently, and they all end so quickly, that very little feels like it has the chance to stick to the same degree as the first game's solid rail shooting. The strategy is, while obviously going to be on the simpler side, a little lacking. Oftentimes, the only consideration is whether or not you can fly to the intended target on time and basing your next move on that. The strategy doesn't exactly feel strategic, even in a more arcadey way. There could be more push and pull. That said, I did have fun with this game on the whole. It's just with how blink and you'll miss it the game can be, it's not rare to end an encounter you literally just started and think, that's it? Then this culminates in you getting to the end of the game, beating Andros and thinking, that's it? There are people who prefer this to the first game, and not without reason. It's definitely unique, far more so than the first game, but as far as execution goes, I honestly prefer the first game over it. So the series is in an interesting spot at this point. We've had the first game establish a gameplay formula, and we've had the second game also establish a gameplay formula. However, in the eyes of most casual consumers at this point, the second game never happened. So the third game can either stick to the core gameplay of the first, or take elements from the second game and take all the credit. In the end, it was a little of column A and a little of column B. This is the first game in the series to not be co-developed by Argonaut Software. This is also the most well-known game in the series, the one to have the most impact on the series going forward, and the one I played as a kid. The core gameplay is akin to that of the first game. It's an arcade-style rail shooter. However, typically for boss encounters, you'll also have all range mode sections that are more akin to something out of Star Fox 2. Returning from Star Fox 2 are Star Wolf encounters, but this time instead of fighting one at a time, you'll be fighting all of them at once. You'll also have multiple crafts from the classic R-Wing to the Landmaster tank, and a submarine everyone likes to conveniently ignore. How convenient. Like in Star Fox 2, you have a laser that charges when you hold the button down and locks on enemies, but now there's a combo system that adds an extra hit for every enemy in range of the blast. The biggest thing that this game brings to the table, though, is through the stage progression. There's a similar map screen to that of the first game, but instead of directly picking the easy, medium, or hard path, you have control over what stage you go to next depending on what you do in each stage. Basically, it's Galaxy Force meets Outrun. So a lot of this sounds really good. On paper, these are strong iterations of the formula and a way to elevate the gameplay to being more than a standard arcade rail shooter, and something more unique, while also retaining the core gameplay. The downside is, well, let's rewind a bit. In this kind of game, your means of interaction are to dodge and shoot. So in order to make a good one, you want your players to be reasonably active with their inputs. The last thing you want to do is make a game where you can put the controller down and watch as the game beats itself. At this game's worst, that is basically what's happening. Look, ma, no hands. Obviously, some stages are better at this than others, but the level design largely asks very, very little of you. Now to clarify, I know that this is a game a lot of people love, and that is not something I wish to take away from anyone. This isn't going to be me telling you that you are stupid for enjoying something. That in of itself would be extremely dumb. Plus, I am the last person on Earth who should be going around saying,
Look at you, playing games that I, random person on the internet, deem mid, unlike me, who only ever plays good games.
Hey! What the fuck is Kokodo?
So I can appreciate this being baby's first rail shooter. It was for me, after all. I can appreciate this game putting a heavier emphasis on the combo system and designing enemy formations around that. I can appreciate the game trying to pace out formations to accommodate players who might not have completely cleared out one set of enemies before another comes in. I can appreciate that while this is an arcade-style game, this is a home console game, and there's less of a need to be difficult because of that. I can understand all of that. but this is too far. And no, I don't buy technical limitations as an excuse here. The original on Super Nintendo hit a better balance of engagement versus approachability. Hell, I have seen games of this genre pull this sort of thing off on the 3DO, Sega CD, Game Boy Advance, and yes, even the Game Boy Color! So I have a bit of a hard time believing that any issues necessitating that the level design be this barren couldn't be overcome, especially when you can unlock a mode with more enemies, though I'll get to that later. Though on a technical level, man is this game not a looker, even for the time. Even with some of the console contemporaries that tried to compete with the original Star Fox managed to have higher texture resolution than this, and at a better frame rate. But okay, let's compare it to something more direct and contemporary. Let's even throw Nintendo a bone and choose one that was for a system that was not that great at handling 3D. But okay, this is all from an outside perspective. Let's hear Argonaut Software's Dylan Cuthbert's thoughts on it. When I first saw Star Fox 64 in a Toys R Us near Sony's HQ in Foster City, California, I have to honestly say that I was surprised at how bad the graphics were. Now maybe the graphics are sacrificed for high performance. After all, that's what Nintendo did with F-Zero X, and they managed to hit 60 FPS with that, which given the shortcomings of the N64 hardware is insanely impressive in its own right. Honestly, given how reaction heavy this kind of game can be, that would probably be ideal here too. Is this even 6 FPS? On original hardware, the frame rate in this game is very inconsistent. A lot of the time, it runs alright as long as there's not a lot going on, which to be fair is fairly often. But on more hardware taxing stages like Solar, well, there's a reason why I called this place the Molasses Planet as a kid, because that's what it runs like. Something I hear a lot from people who gravitate towards this game over the original is, yeah, I see what you're saying about the level design, but I don't know, I don't think I could handle that frame rate. Okay, that's totally fair. Quick question, why are you playing N64 games? Though to be honest, that's rhetorical, because chances are, if people are playing Star Fox 64, they're not playing it on original hardware like I am for some reason, because unlike the original, which has always been locked to its frame rate, Star Fox 64 has been re-released with the frame rate magically better. It's not like it's been particularly hard to emulate. Hell, it's been remade from the ground up on 3DS, and that's before we get into the recent recompiled project. Now normally, I wouldn't be fixating so much on the graphics of nearly 30-year-old games, however, the key thing that drew people to the series to begin with was its technical prowess. Whoa, you can't do that on a console! And by the second release, that was already gone. If anything, the technically impressive flight game on Nintendo hardware throne was usurped by another software house that also cut their teeth on the Amiga, called Factor 5.
You probably know where this is going.
I've been trying to keep Rogue Squadron comparisons to a minimum, because while they are flight combat games rooted in arcade sensibilities, they are both different kinds of flight game. Star Fox is straightforward arcade action, Rogue Squadron is more of a strategy action game with larger maps to explore and a lot more push and pull factors in its design. However, I bring this up here because not only is the type of flight game more technically taxing and more impressive to pull off, but it's doing so with higher polygon counts on, well, everything, higher resolution textures, far more impressive dynamic lighting, and at a far more solid frame rate.
You wanna see me do it again?
When the N64 was still the current platform, and as a kid who was enthralled with anything with 3D and video game in the same sentence, Star Fox 64 was the N64 flight game that I played when Rogue Squadron wasn't available. Obviously, that's not a fair lens to look at the game through. They are going for different things, but even now I think there are better alternatives made both before and after this game. While there weren't that many rail shooters on the N64 for people to compare this to, it had Sin and Punishment for crying out loud. Not that the average Joe in the US renting games from Blockbuster would be too aware of it.
We don't sin here in America, boy.
The most direct frame of reference most N64 owners probably had at this point was the flight sections of Shadows of the Empire, and Star Fox 64 compares alright enough to it visually. However, it probably doesn't say anything good that, yeah, it looks okay in comparison to a game that started production well before the developers had any dev kits or any documentation, so they had to design blindly in their engine for their Doom-style FPS Dark Forces. Yet, despite the game being designed like a first-person shooter and being most playable when played as one, Shigeru Miyamoto barges in and starts telling the developers that the player must always be able to see Dash Rendar's feet. Then when Nintendo did start giving them those things, they didn't want anyone to see the controller. They put it in a box and told the developers to put their hands inside the box to feel it. And despite all of that bullshit, and despite the game's many, many issues, it still runs better than Star Fox 64. Okay, so the game isn't very technically impressive, and the hazard and enemy placement can leave a lot to be desired. But the game did promise more than that. For one, there's the thing people have probably been screaming about at their monitors for the past several minutes. What about the characters? In the first game, they were a neat little flourish, but also pretty easy to ignore. Here, the story takes more of a center stage. You are part of an elite starfighter team working independently from, but in conjunction with the dominant power in the galaxy, the Cornerian army. Meanwhile, there's a mad scientist in the form of a floating monkey head named Andros who wants to use his army to take over. Your father was an elite pilot before you, and everyone who knew him can't stop talking about how skilled he was and how much like him you are. Never heard that one before. However, he was betrayed by another pilot named Pigma who turned bad, and now your father is dead. So basically the story is Star Wars, but if Obi-Wan's cover story was true. That's not where the similarities end, mind you. This is just the throne room scene from A New Hope. Now, taking elements and shots from other pieces of media isn't inherently bad at all. This is how art communicates with each other. In fact, Star Wars is doing it in that very scene. Triumph of the Will is a Nazi propaganda film where... So with Star Wars being a very anti-authoritarian film, there are a lot of cinematography techniques borrowed from Nazi propaganda films in use for the Empire. So to have this cinematography style being used in reference to the enemy's power and might, then to have the heroes blow up their tools of oppression, that cinematography being used here is the film's way of saying non-verbally that they took the enemy's power away from them. Meanwhile, that imagery, again, originally from Nazi propaganda, is taken out of context, lumped into this, a text where you're not taking the role of an underclass fighting against tyranny, but the dominant power structure and...
Are you gonna listen to that monkey?
Am I saying that Nintendo did any of this deliberately? No, I genuinely do not believe that. What I do think is that this demonstrates the discrepancy between a piece of media choosing its imagery very deliberately to visually communicate themes and information, and another doing the same thing because they saw it in a movie and thought it looked cool. Moving away from the futile exercise of trying to make non-political science fiction, the characters are basic caricatures at best. Determined, cocky, movie quotes, and rookie. Granted, all of this is in a late 90s video game by Nintendo of all people. I'm not expecting Shakespeare here. I just don't see it as a selling point for the game in retrospect. Frankly, what saves this from being completely tedious is the very cheesy voice acting.
You're not as stupid as you look! Too bad Dad's not here to see you fail! They're not taking me seriously.
Honestly, the audio is probably the best thing about this game. Perhaps it's the nostalgia talking, but the sound effects are very memorable and impactful. The ambiance on the main menu just takes me away from it all, and the score in general is well written. Instead of the mix of orchestral, electronic, and rock from the previous games, this leans a lot harder into a more cinematic and Wagnerian style of music. This style of music can actually be deceptively difficult to pull off, but I feel in terms of composition alone, they do a good job. Where it falters a bit is the orchestration. What do I mean by this? Well, this kind of music is built to lend itself to storytelling, with not only a larger emphasis on tension and release, but using the instrumentations on hand for emphasis and also have the performance evolve and shift accordingly. Now, this all sounds an insane expectation. You're asking for crescendos and articulation in a game on a system with no sound chip? There's no way anyone could pull that up. Factor 5 did it, didn't they? On one hand, these games do have an unfair advantage in terms of being able to fall back on the work of, well, one of the best composers of all time. Despite that, they largely do their own thing, as there's a lot of original themes in these games. Then when they do use the existing motifs, they work them into the compositions in more original ways. Like, listen to this lead-in, and while I play it, pay attention to just how much is going on and how the intensity builds, falls, and shifts. That's not to say that there's none of this here, because there is. It's just not as much. There's less variation in samples for the instruments being used, and the texture in general is a lot thinner. That's not to say that it's bad. Again, it is well written, but this is definitely a case of a game soundtrack being fine on its own, but if performed or reworked in just the right way, it could become something outstanding. And thankfully, we will be getting to that later. We also have those branching paths to talk about. How do those fare? I made the base comparison to Outrun earlier, but how you move from one path to another is quite different. Instead of having the option at the end of a stage, it'll be based on certain criteria unique to the stage. I think, again, this is genuinely a good idea, and could serve to incentivize more interaction with your surroundings than in other games like this. However, once again, the execution of that idea varies a little bit. The example everyone points to is the boss on the easy path, where it'll send Slippy crash landing on the planet below with Fox in pursuit, whereas if you beat the boss before it can even do that, you'll go to a different stage. This is a very solid execution of the concept, but not all the stages are like this. Let's talk about the very first level. When I was a kid, I hated Medio. I thought it was so boring, and frankly, I don't blame myself for that because it is. So to see the map screen between stages and see that I could be playing a different level altogether just made me want to play that instead. One time I was determined. I figured that if I was on the easy path and the other options were harder, all I had to do was get good. So I went out of my way to try to shoot down every enemy I saw. I got the other option and I was thrilled. Problem was, I couldn't reproduce those results upon subsequent playthroughs, and it drove me nuts. Then I heard someone say, "Oh yeah, all you need to do is fly through all of the stone arches in that little water section." I booted up the game, I did so, and was so pissed off.
I think the funny needs a mustache.
No, the game does not tell you this. The only thing indicating you're doing anything is when you're halfway through doing it, Falco says,
Pretty smooth flying, Fox.
which frankly doesn't communicate much and could apply to almost anything else that you're doing here. Conversely, if the only feedback you get happens when you're already committing to doing it, then ultimately becomes you knew how to do the thing because you already knew how to do the thing. Ironically, Medio, the very stage I was trying to avoid, has a far better execution of this idea. At one point later in the stage, you come across these speed boosters that send you spinning faster and faster with each one. Hit all of the boosters without missing, and you'll get a warp. Hitting them all is something that the player will be drawn to do, but would probably be too tricky for a first-time player to pull off. Yet you figure you'd get something out of doing that, as opposed to just assuming it's part of the scenery. There's a proper pull factor here instead of basically nothing. Plus, while the hard path stages are generally more fun than the easy ones, Unfun Submarine notwithstanding, not only is that a step down from the first game, where the game was fun no matter what path you took, but even the hardest stages feel like what would be the first or second level in any other flight rail shooter. However, that's where Expert Mode comes in. It's Star Fox 64, but with more enemies and a pair of shades. This is not an option from the outset. It's something the game doesn't even tell you about, and you have to unlock it. So, how do you unlock it? Well, if you hit an unspecified amount of enemies in a stage, you'll get a medal. Get a medal on every stage in the game, and you'll unlock Expert Mode. Neat. The catch is, the amount you have to hit often exceeds the number of enemies you'll actually come across. This is where the combo system comes in. But in levels like, say, Corneria, my favorite, you'll often come short anyway. As it turns out, these levels can be deceptively wide, and part of the reason why you don't see too many enemies if you just go straight ahead in this game where you go straight ahead is because they scattered them all the way to the left and all the way to the right. Hell, they deliberately hid enemies behind buildings. So while in the first game, you use the vertically rotated position to barely scrape by obstacles in the nick of time, you can forget about doing anything fun like that here. Here, you're doing it while braking as you comb these empty abysses for enough things to shoot in the vain hope that you'll unlock something more fun to do. I don't feel like an ace pilot making use of her reflexes and observational skills. I feel like I'm vacuuming. Not only that, but there are specific areas that will spawn in more enemies. If you miss them or don't know exactly where they are, those enemies will not appear. So if you tried and failed to hit the 150 target in Corneria that the game doesn't even tell you about because you didn't know about the placement of invisible objects and their behaviors, do not let anyone tell you that it's a skill issue. It's just bad game design. Oh, and don't forget to not let a single one of your teammates retreat. If you mess up at any point and want to reset, it costs you a life, which on the first level is quite pointless to inflict upon yourself, so each time you miss a spawner or Falco runs off, you gotta get out of your chair, lean forward, hit the reset button on the console, and try again. All the while, the console itself is struggling to keep going, begging, no, pleading you to put it out of its misery because it just can't handle this unoptimized, blurry bullshit. I'd also like to remind you that you need to do this for every stage in the game. Yet despite everything, I did it. I got the medal for every stage. You wanna know why this video took so long? Actually, there's a lot of things that don't have much to do with the video, but this wasn't helping. And yes, the game is more fun this way, but at what cost? Because getting to that point is tedious. This is a game that expects you to play it in a specific way, but whenever the player deviates from that, the game falls apart. Whether it's due to missing stuff because the game indulges in the classic faux pas of, you want to enjoy this game? Here, buy our magazine. Or just avoiding the level design by putting the controller down and watching your ship work its way through. Yet the only thing pulling the player to do anything more involved than the bare minimum is the allure of a mode that the game doesn't even tell you about. Too long didn't read? Not my favorite. At the very least, the general approach and iteration on the formula here are not fundamentally broken. This isn't a late 2010s Pac-Man game. This isn't dead on arrival. This is merely a case of a game having good ideas, but ultimately the execution has some room for improvement. That's a lot of games. This isn't an abomination or anything like that.
That said, we still have plenty of games to go, and all a sequel needs to be is Star Fox 64, but better. Surely Nintendo, of all companies, isn't going to mismanage this series at every turn. Are you fucking kidding me?
To clarify, this is not a bad game, and the development story behind this game is rather well known. Rare was making a large-scale action RPG for the Nintendo 64 called Dinosaur Planet that was set to be their magnum opus for the platform. Nintendo comes in and tells them to move it to the GameCube, therefore forcing them to start a lot of the work from scratch and make it a Star Fox game. From there, it was a race to finish the game before they were bought by Microsoft. This game had a negative reputation for a long time from Star Fox fans because it had so little resemblance to the prior games. Meanwhile, it also has a cult following of people obsessed with the development history behind the game, and namely, what was left on the cutting room floor. On a completely different note, I got my GameCube as a kid through one of those Costco bundles where the system was packaged with a bunch of accessories, and I distinctly remember seeing this game in a different variant of that bundle.
So I almost had this game as a kid.
On second thought, I'm glad I didn't have this game as a kid.
Feels like I'm wearing nothing at all.
Now here's the part where you'd expect me to make some kind of joke about furries, but honestly that would be lazy. Besides, when one goes through the hell of replacing your CDI's timekeeper battery so the thing doesn't brick itself, the very least you could do is not be a dick. So I'm going to refrain from making any sweeping generalizations or singling people out. Oh, that doesn't mean I'm not going to make fun of this character design, because I absolutely am. The original design was fine, and honestly, the scene at the start where she meets the villain is a lot more impactful with her being smaller and more cutesy. Frankly, said villain needs all the help he can get because he sounds like this.
General Scales. Hiku, Kohud, Otaskuki, Eve Dinosaur Planet.
But I guess when trying to make her fit more closely with the existing Star Fox cast, someone had ideas on how to do that. Yet despite all of that, she's trapped in the very thing she's named after and astral projects her gibberish-spouting, disembodied head to Fox, hereby turning the game into Crystal Teaches Typing 2 and thus causing me to lose my mind even more than I already have.
I'm going to fly for you.
As far as gameplay goes, you can see how Rare were trying to make this what Banjo-Kazooie was to Mario 64 to Ocarina of Time. The shop system, for instance, is far more fleshed out, giving you mini-games to gamble and even a bartering system where you can attempt to negotiate for a lower price. Exploring the world from overworlds to dungeons feels a lot more seamless, and there's a lot of additions like a far more fleshed out and interactive partner throughout your adventure. I could see people finding Tricky annoying, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't a little, but I think it's intentional to agree. Fox is portrayed as the trigger-happy fighter that has to work completely out of his wheelhouse and just wants this mission over and done with, while Tricky is the excited little kid bouncing off the walls and getting into trouble. It works as a dynamic, and I like how Fox's portrayal fits his pre-existing gameplay, and the whole fish-out-of-water elements in the writing does land instead of coming across as too meta. Also, being an early, high-profile GameCube game by a technically proficient studio, this game looks gorgeous. I'm not the biggest fan of what they did to the ship designs. I honestly think they look a little too rounded and rubbery. The environments, on the other hand, are breathtaking. As someone who can't get enough of early GameCube aesthetic, I dig this real good. Combine that with a solid David Wise soundtrack, and the sense of atmosphere in the game is absolutely fantastic. This can be a nice game to play on a relaxing afternoon. Frankly, at least for me, the atmosphere alone is the selling point here. Easily the best thing about this game by a country mile. The aspect that feels the most tacked on is the R-Wing flying sections. They all use a remix of the theme for Medio in Star Fox 64, the enemies feel very generic, and the rocks and land masses you fly over just feel like basic height maps. That said, these stages do throw more at you than Star Fox 64, so that's hilarious. Generally, what's here is honestly quite good. However, there's a reason why people have fixated on Dinosaur Planet all of these years rather than the game we actually have. It's very hard not to get the sense that this game would have been so much more if they kept it to plan and were able to complete it how they wanted to. The game needing to be remade and retooled as part of an otherwise unrelated IP definitely held it back and set up false expectations. Fans of Star Fox wondered what the hell this has to do with that series, and people who were able to look past that and appreciate what's there ended up being frustrated by what the game isn't in a completely different way. It's a genuinely weird situation, because while it's not a bad game at all, if anything, it's even quite decent, it's also really hard not to look at it as a fuck-up on Nintendo's part. This was one of the early GameCube games that Nintendo promoted heavily. If you go back and watch GameCube promos from 2001 to 2002, this game is all over them. It's easy to forget, but this was a pretty high-profile game, and one that kinda fell on its face. This game ended up communicating to people that this series was stagnating and spiraling out of control, so that probably didn't incentivize people to pick up the system in the way that Nintendo wanted them to. Oh well, at least they had Smash Brothers for that. And Rogue Leader. Oh yeah, Nintendo promoted the hell out of that game too, and that ended up being a really good call on their part. It appealed to the hardcore older crowd that Nintendo was trying to bring in at that time, showed off what the system could do, was a strong sign of third-party support, it sold GameCubes, and if you were disappointed with Star Fox Adventures and wanted next-gen flight arcade action on a grander scope than just a rail shooter, Rogue Leader had you covered. The first Rogue Squadron proved other companies could get more out of Nintendo's hardware than they could. Then, in the early days of their next console, its sequel basically filled the hole Nintendo left in their own lineup.
Epic Space Combat. Star Wars Rogue Leader. Only for Nintendo GameCube.
Nintendo needed to course correct, and they started by legitimately making some damn fine choices. Remember how I mentioned Namco's Starblade being a key inspiration behind Star Fox? Well, why don't we let Namco take a stab at it? They made use of the team within Namco who brought us Ace Combat 4 for the PS2, which was a damn good choice, and a good sign of intent. However, Nintendo showed the game off way too early. What was there was clearly a rough proof of concept for the multiplayer. Apparently though, that was enough for them to whip up this logo, hire a voice actor to do nonsensical narration, and make a teaser trailer. Initial reactions were not positive.
Battle throughout the galaxy, from Earth to the stars. Falco joins the adventure.
Where is
Falco?
I don't see him, only you!
Yet despite Nintendo jumping the gun on announcing and showing it, the game didn't come out until 2005, which is well after the point where people largely stopped paying attention to the GameCube. Well, other than me. Which is a shame too, because if you ask me, despite all of that bumbling, Namco delivered one of the better entries in the series here. For one, the rail shooting here is genuinely fantastic. Like in the original Super Nintendo game, the developers hit a really good balance of keeping the player active while being approachable to those less experienced with the genre. However, not only do they make good use of Star Fox 64's combo system, but they play around a lot more with the camera, making it feel like a combination of Star Fox's classic rail shooting with that of Starblade. In fact, the keen-eyed will probably be able to notice a ton of classic Namco Easter eggs, including the aforementioned rail shooter to Galaga and Galaxian. All range mode makes a return here, but it handles so much better than it did in 64. You're given far more space a lot of the time, and you can also see where you're aiming while turning as opposed to just seeing the side of your ship. What doesn't return, on the other hand, is the map screen. Instead of having different paths with unique sets of levels, here you're limited to the same levels with more standard difficulty options. This is honestly one of the key areas where the game does disappoint, sadly, but they use that linear progression to put more emphasis on the story, which, considering the direction the gaming industry was moving in at that point, was probably a smart decision, at least commercially. Plus, if one of the key things that separates this series from other rail shooters is the characters, then the game putting more emphasis on them is a good move. Luckily, the game does take advantage of both. If Star Fox 64's plot was a homage to Star Wars, this is much more in the vein of the Borg from Star Trek. Honestly, I kinda like this direction for the series, paying homage to different science fiction stories as opposed to just sticking to one.
I must bring an end to our relationship! Uncle Andros!
The characters start off feeling pretty stiff, especially Fox himself, but as the story goes on, they do feel more realized. Part of what helps this is the sense of urgency and the high stakes, and it doesn't feel empty either. The sense that they're all on the precipice of losing everything is effectively vivid, even if that tension is occasionally undercut by... What the hell is that posture? Oh no, the base is under attack! I better head to my ship. There are some welcome tweaks made to the combo system here. For one, if you kill every enemy in a formation, you get a plus 10 hit bonus, and any enemies destroyed in a single blast are tallied on top of that. All range mode and on foot have a different combo system where every enemy killed contributes to a timer, and you have to get into a steady rhythm of hits, linking multiple groups together throughout the map. Despite having two separate combo systems for different styles of play, this ironically does make the game feel more unified as you try to adjust how you play each level to optimize for enemy hits. Star Fox 64 tried to do this as well with its medals, but I honestly think that this is a stronger execution of that idea.
I mean, the game actually telling you what number to shoot for and how the final count tallies up is quite nice. The game also handles secrets much better. Certain targets and routes may include item drops like Rally X flags, and the cause and effect relationship is a lot more discernible than flying through a random hole spawning more enemies. Here, you can lock onto invisible targets and you shooting them spawns the item. The game won't outright tell you where they are, but you do have more to work with. I genuinely had a fun time learning these stages. On the note of 64 but better, oh my god, the music! So, despite the more linear stage progression, this seems to be a clear improvement over 64. But what's the catch? Well, like Rogue Squadron 3 did 2 years prior, this game introduces on-foot combat. However, unlike Rebel Strike, you can take off from and land your ship wherever you want to, and this leads to situations where you need to do something on foot with a limited time frame before it starts impacting what's going on in the air. Honestly, I think this approach is more of what Rogue Squadron 3 should have done with its ground combat. However, despite how cool that sounds, they really don't do a lot with it. The only ground objective a lot of the time is to destroy the same spawner targets, and the time frame you're given is generous to the point where it almost isn't even a factor. Then you get to the final world where you have to shoot down targets in tight claustrophobic corridors, and the camera gets... What fares much better, on the other hand, is the multiplayer. Now, to be fair, 64 had multiplayer too. But despite how much I played Mario Kart 64's multiplayer back in the day, my siblings, cousins, and I rarely ever played Star Fox 64's multiplayer together. Last time my girlfriend was up, we decided to for this video, and I can see why. It's very half-baked, if even that. It feels like a really rough prototype test. Yet meanwhile, over the years, I have played Assault's multiplayer with relatives and friends because yeah, it's a huge improvement. Regardless of if you're in the air, in a landmaster, or on foot, you feel like you have more of a fighting chance, and because of that and the variety of weapons, better maps, and the like, you have room for the perfect kind of couch multiplayer chaos. When playing 64's multiplayer together, my girlfriend and I were honestly pretty bored. Here though, we were laughing and shouting the entire time. I understand the more linear stage progression is disappointing after 64, and the greater presence of all range mode and ground combat means you're going to be spending less time with rail shooting, but honestly, I prefer this to 64 by quite a large margin. In fact, I hold it in similar regard I do to the Super Nintendo original, which is nice to say after a few games of not being able to. This is one I would give a solid recommendation. Despite Assault being a genuinely good time, it wasn't helped by being a late GameCube game. But hey, we have a handheld that's flying off the shelves, so let's put one on that. Development this time was handled by Q Games, a company headed up by Dylan Cuthbert, previously from Argonaut Software, who handled development for the Super Nintendo games. This time we get basically an updated take on Star Fox 2. You control different ships at once, drawing their paths with the touchscreen as you try to destroy all the enemies, bases, and missiles on the map. In fact, this game is largely controlled with the touchscreen, which might be a deterrent for many. Consequently, scenario types aren't as varied as Star Fox 2, and you'll see a lot of the same things over and over again. However, what I think this does a lot better than Star Fox 2 is provide a sense of causality, as these sequences feel a lot more connected to each other and the main map. Different characters have different ships with their own strengths and weaknesses, and it isn't just a matter of taking care of everything before it gets too close, but also thinking about who would be best served for what kind of target, and balancing that with where they are on that turn. The strategy feels a lot stronger and more fully realized. There's actually some push and pull and risk versus reward going on. They even incorporate the branching paths in 64 and tie that into the story, and this is probably the most infamous thing about the game. The basic story is Fox broke up with Crystal and everyone is bitter about it. However, instead of taking a more dramatic approach with that setup, the cutscenes largely devolve to Fox going from character to character hoping someone will be nice to him, only for them to shatter those hopes by calling him out. This relationship drama, mixed with the branching paths, leads to wildly absurd and contradictory endings. However, you might have noticed the lack of footage I have here, because that leads me to the key drawback with this game. Because it's so reliant on the touchscreen for everything, good luck playing it on anything else. The game was released for the DS, and aside from a Wii U Virtual Console release, it hasn't been available to the general public in any other way. In an attempt to get at least some footage for this video, I tried emulating it on my computer and my Steam Deck, and both did not fare well. So unless you have a DS and a copy of this game, good luck trying to play it. Now, this isn't so much a fault of the game itself, but perhaps highlights something about Nintendo's insistence on gimmicks, but we'll get back to that. But hey, we have 2 solid entries in a row. Let's hope that keep that streak going. This game has been dragged through the mud time and time again. And to be fair, I think a bit of it is undeserved. However, the game does legitimately have some glaring issues that hold it back, not just to the point of being frustrating, but also becoming a perfect reflection of everything wrong with the series. This game is a reboot of the series that primarily harkens back to 64, serving as a quasi-remake of it. This brought up a lot of comparisons to the later New Super Mario Bros. Games in the sense of being a nostalgia-pandering inferior rehash of 64, but honestly, saying this is the new Super Mario Bros. Wii of Star Fox is completely backwards. The level design is much tighter, with far better use of enemy formations and things to dodge. Unfortunately, Assault's additions to the combo system are gone, which is a shame. Otherwise, when looking at the rail shooting on offer, Platinum Games genuinely did an excellent job here, giving us some of the best levels in the series. The conditions of the branching paths are also a lot more consistently clear, albeit pretty obvious. And like Assault, the game tells you the hit numbers needed to get medals. It also brings back the walker from Star Fox 2, and it's genuinely fun to use. It ends up feeling like a faster and more refined take on the on-foot sections from Assault. That and this music is fantastic. I'm having fun with this. I'm actually having fun with it. Oh no.
No, not you.
Star Fox Zero is a perfect example of a game that is fun until it isn't. When this game is most directly comparable to 64, it's a dramatic improvement, and I think that often gets overlooked. When it's not, it usually sucks. It genuinely is the most uneven game in an uneven series. The forced gyro aiming that repeatedly desyncs, forcing you to repeatedly recalibrate, is annoying. The now asymmetric all-range mode is all too often a pain, and the gyro wing is basically everything wrong with Nintendo's design philosophies and so much wrong with video games past the end of the 6th generation in general. The game is genuinely fun when it's allowed to be, but then the game remembers that it has Nintendo breathing down its neck, so it's contractually obligated to add stupid shit that ruins everything. Which sucks because let's look back to what I said earlier. All a sequel needs to be is Star Fox 64, but better.
We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close.
But let's tackle those issues in order. The forced gyro aiming is probably what the game is most infamous for, but to be honest, I hardly consider that to be the thing that killed the game. In the options menu, you can't turn it off completely, but you can set it to only activate when actually pressing the fire button. This actually does help, and I don't mind the inclusion for some extra precision, but the lack of any option to turn it off is needlessly annoying. However, when playing the game in the rail shooting and walker sections with this mode turned on, it's bearable. Where it boils my piss is when it combines with issue number 2, the asymmetric all-range sections. You see, you can't play the game with any other controller than the Wii U gamepad. This is because the game displays multiple camera perspectives at once, one on the TV and one on the gamepad screen. At first this seems rather pointless, but hardly an issue. In all-range mode, however, the game will deliberately choose unhelpful camera angles to necessitate you to look back and forth between screens and therefore justify this gimmick.
A lot of the time, you won't be able to see where you're going or what you're aiming at on the TV, and in cockpit view, you don't have much spatial awareness of your surrounding area. Not that the TV view does much to help with that. This isn't fun. This isn't even challenging. It's taking what should be fundamentally simple and needlessly making it a complete chore. Like, the first level has you take out these large guns on a ship like this, and I don't know about you, but something is telling me that it doesn't need to be this cumbersome. Then we get to the dreaded gyro wing. It's a slow-ass drone that controls differently from everything else, and you can deploy a tiny, annoyingly voiced robot to slowly go into tiny crevices and slowly scan these panels while leaving the ship itself a sitting duck. Needless to say, it controls quite awkwardly and is a complete slog to use. Don't worry, it gets better, because later the R-Wing in the Walker formation gets the ability to scan these panels too, thus making this ship and this entire mechanic completely redundant. So much so, in fact, that you can unlock a different version of the main Gyro-Wing focus level where you use the R-Wing instead. So yes, this was padding. They made this monstrosity not only to justify the gyro aiming and asymmetric gameplay gimmicks, but also to waste your time in order to make the game longer in order to justify the asking price. It's so frustrating because these things aren't nothing or something that can be just waved away. They're substantial issues and rear their heads way too much. But when they're not there and the game is just allowed to be a fun space shooter, it isn't just good, it's fantastic. They had a damn good game here, but they deliberately made the decisions that made it less than that. There's that famous Shigeru Miyamoto quote that a rushed game is forever bad and a delayed game is eventually good. Actually, just kidding, that wasn't him. In the article Solved, if Miyamoto never said his most famous quote, who did, Critical Kate Willard writes, "This quote is often attributed to Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto, who famously led the development of Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. But when I tried locating the source of this quote, the earliest I could find it attributed to Miyamoto wasn't an interview, but a 2003 Usenet post complaining about Rebellion's first-person shooter Judge Dredd, Dredd vs. Death of all things. This was not a good sign. Even worse, the further back we go, the more varied the phrasing of the quote becomes. I eventually learned that it was said by Ellen Guan, who attributed it to her significant other. While tweeting about my latest attempts, a mutual pointed out to me that the reason I've been having so much trouble finding her is that she's since transitioned and changed her name to Siobhan Beeman. This is such a not uncommon occurrence in the gaming industry that honestly, anytime I can't find someone and there's no obituary, I assume they've simply transitioned.
Listen, I was trying to leave the gender shit out of it this time, but you forced my hand!
Regardless of who said it or not, that's not always true. Sometimes a game gets off on the wrong foot and is made with a fundamentally flawed mindset, and as long as that continues, it doesn't matter how much time it spends in development. You'll just be polishing a turd at that point. If anything, that quote tends to fall apart the most when it's turned back around at Nintendo's own titles. Star Fox Zero doesn't feel rushed or poorly polished. All of its problems were put there intentionally. These weren't bugs, they were deliberate choices, and unless that time is put into undoing them, no amount of delays was going to make this game better. Yet because of the insistence on making use of the hardware gimmicks, this game isn't just held back, it's held hostage on a dead system that was never popular to begin with. So, this series is kind of a mess, albeit in different ways than I was expecting going in. For one, this series has a weird monkey's paw effect, where you can never just have a good Star Fox game with no qualifiers. Each game is held back in some way, and which one you ultimately gravitate towards is down to what you're willing to put up with, whether it be low frame rates, ditching progression systems, or dumb gimmicks. Personally, my favorites are the original and Assault, with Command being the runner-up. In many ways, these games have wildly different problems, but in another way, so many of them suffer the same problem: Nintendo themselves. Nintendo is famous for not wanting to make a new game in a series unless they have a big enough idea for it, or if it makes them a lot of money. But their thinking can be really myopic on the matter. They tend to think that just because the broad strokes are there, that means their job is done and there's nothing more that they can do. If we're lucky, they either pass it on to another developer, or the team finds a way to effectively trick them into letting them cook. And that's usually the point where we hit peak actualization. It doesn't help that Star Fox is in a weirder position than a lot of other Nintendo franchises. It didn't run out of ideas before being passed to another developer. Other developers were involved from the beginning. It's both that Nintendo series where they have no ideas for it, so they have other people make it, and a Miyamoto baby that they will micromanage in the most baffling ways. They can never just evolve. They have to find some clean slate. They won't make entry number 2, they'd prefer to start back at 0. So despite Nintendo partnering with genuinely talented developers who are able to iterate on the core gameplay well, Star Fox can never have its F-Zero GX.
Or, Nintendo was looking for partners for Star Fox.
Oh, that's right.
At Wii U, they said that at
E3. Did you see that demo?
I saw that demo, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. We'd love to make a Star Fox game. We just don't know who will make it.
I think to a certain degree, because it's a Miyamoto property, it's always tough to do that as a Westerner. Because the communication with Japan isn't that easy. So I think the best result for Star Fox very well might be if it's either a retro, which has a long embedded experience there, or if it's actually a Japanese team collaborating, which Platinum would be awesome.
So yeah, I can see why fans of the series can be so frustrated with Nintendo's treatment of it. It's honestly really hard not to. At the same time though, I can see why, despite playing the games as a kid and even liking a fair few of them, they never really stuck with me to the same degree as others. Usually when making an argument that another game is better than a Nintendo game in the same space, it's not uncommon to hear responses akin to, yeah, easy to say that about a game that came out after. Your game wouldn't exist if it weren't for this Nintendo game. Except here, the genre in question was largely in the rear view mirror. Nintendo weren't late to the party by a year or two, they were late by a decade, and by then, people had already figured out how to make a good flight rail shooter. What Nintendo genuinely accomplished was bring this kind of game over to their console in a very impressive way. But wait, they didn't do that. Argonaut Software and their contracted engineers did.
Well, it's hard to say. He may have come up with the recipe, but I came up with the idea of charging $6.95 for it.
But okay, to be more fair, the biggest tangible impact Star Fox seemed to have on the gaming industry was ignite more fierce competition for this kind of game on home consoles. However, as we moved into the 5th console generation, as consoles got better at handling 3D, and as games started to shift to more long-term experiences, the console flight combat game moved away from rail shooting and more towards free-form, landscape-driven, objective-based fare. As we moved to the 6th generation, that was the dominant style of flight combat on consoles, with rail shooters being viewed more and more as outdated, at best appearing as a mini-game or a side mode in something larger. Now, it's not that Star Fox didn't make the odd attempt to work itself into the more contemporary style, but it was always a non-committal tiptoe before turning into more of a confused game of tug-of-war, caught between the rail shooters of the 80s and early 90s and the landscape-driven flight shooters of the late 90s and early 2000s. By the time it was starting to inch itself towards more open flight combat, it was the late 2010s, and that kind of flight game was also long dead because people couldn't handle peak. For most of its life, Star Fox was a gateway to a dead genre. Now, I like these genres, so this isn't a problem for me. My problem here is the lack of focus. I'm all for a series being more experimental. The challenge you come across when doing that is the classic ship of Theseus conundrum. How much can you take away and replace before it's no longer the same ship? The best examples tend to be when you can identify core sensibilities of what you're adapting and find new ways to carry them over or reach that result. Hell, they've done this before, so we know that they can do it when they understand what they're working with. But I really don't think they do here. Their insistence on finding a gimmick falls flat so often because they can't find a way for it to complement or expand the gameplay. Instead, they largely just interrupt. Personally, I think the strongest idea Star Fox had to give itself a concrete identity was 64 stage progression, a rail shooter where you can interact with your surroundings more heavily, with that impacting how the stage progresses and where you end up is a genuinely solid angle. They just could have done it better. But hey, we can tap into that potential, right? Oops, too bad. We can't try that again for another 19 years, and even then the catch is we have to find a really stupid way to try and ruin it. However, there's another reason for a lot of this. I mentioned the shift away from rail shooting to more open objective-based fare. It wasn't just technological advancement that drove it. A mindset was brewing amongst the gaming populace, and as it did, we start to see the same complaint rear its ugly head whenever this series got a new entry. One that will end up being the Grim Reaper here to claim the souls of entire genres. For you see, Nintendo's bumbling isn't the only adversary this series must face. There is a greater villain at work here. One that stands to thin out the kinds of games you play, draining everything and everyone in its path until there is nothing left. In the mid-1990s, a shift started to occur. Arcades fell out of favor as more stakes were put into the home market. Games like Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VII provided longer story-driven experiences, and there was a greater pressure to make longer, more feature-rich games. This didn't kill the smaller game overnight, but the die had started to roll. Then in the 6th generation, Grand Theft Auto 3 brought the open-world sandbox game into vogue, and once again, the bar for what made a game worth buying increased. Then we had the 7th generation, with more expensive consoles,
$599 US,
increased pressure for production values, a price increase in games, and another shifting of the flagpole. The big thing this console generation? Sandbox action RPGs, more open world games, first-person shooters, and cutscenes with sprinkles of gameplay in between.
Dear PlayStation, I've been playing Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, but my girlfriend won't stop watching because she thinks it's a movie.
Yeah, I'm gonna file this under not an issue.
This is when I think things got bad. Now, there's nothing wrong with bigger games on their own. The problem is when that becomes the baseline expectation. As these shifts happened, we went from a bigger is better mentality to a bigger is mandatory mentality. Yet with every aspect of development now costing way more time and money, this ended up putting a strain on those trying to meet that standard.
So not only have we reached the detail level of movies and rendering capabilities of movies, but in terms of production value, we have to deliver more than the movie guys ever had to do.
Simply put, it's easier to make some genres longer than others, and the ones that prevailed in this generation were the ones that could stretch themselves out. In something more rooted in arcade sensibilities like a platformer, you need to make stages distinct, introduce elements, iterate, flesh them out, and then do that again. Yet, if it's more expensive to make every single asset, and it's something that you're effectively only going to see for a second, and in an environment you're only going to see once, it seriously changes how you make those games, and most major companies stopped. In the 6th generation, you could still make a game that you could beat in a couple of hours, put time into post-game, and throw in a bunch of extras, including other games. Now we can't do that. All of that dev time needs to be spent on the main game, and we need to find any way we can to stretch that shit out.
And we're using the beautiful backdrop of the bridge again. As we realized, I think production values wise, pretty early on in the project, that if we try to do the traditional way, we always did it and many people did it, where basically every single level has a new environment.
Yeah, we couldn't do that this time. So right. Yeah, the original thought was to do this very sandboxy experience, very player driven. You could come and go as you please, and we would just have so much content in that space that that would be enough. But I think we quickly ran up against the realities of, one, just creating a bunch of content that no one would see. If there's 5 battles going on and you're engaged in one of them, then we just built 5 games and you played one of them, and that was really a hard one to swallow.
In any other medium, we have this thing called editing. One of the key things you're taught when editing is, if it doesn't add anything of substance, get rid of it. But we can't do that here. Oh no, we can only make a half hour of the game we actually want to make. Better fill it up with at least 5 hours of filler. Anything less, and sometimes even if we do, we'll get blasted for the game being too short and therefore not worth the money. This is how genres die. This is how smaller studios close. And this is how a market shrinks until it's just the biggest companies before they consolidate and cannibalize the industry, leaving game development itself unsustainable. Allow me to put some things into perspective. Star Fox on the Super Nintendo was $60. Now, part of that is the Super FX chip bumping it up, but yes, this game, you can beat in half an hour, cost $60, and people loved it. But wait, that's not today's money, that's 1993 money. In today's money, that's $133.18. Yes, it's a game that had a certain degree of novelty around it, but the price was deemed appropriate enough for people to still buy the thing in droves. But alright, let's fast forward about a decade. Rogue Leader was $50 in 2001. It was a launch title for the GameCube. No additional hardware chips needed. In today's money, that's around $90. And let me remind you that you can beat this game in like 2 hours. Oh, you'd expect this to be reviled for that. But it wasn't. It was lauded. People loved it. They considered it worth getting the console for at launch. If you factor that in, they were spending $450 in today's money for this game you can beat in a couple of hours and were still satisfied. Hell, in the generation since, we have people looking back at games like this wondering why they can't make games like this today. Speaking for myself, the 4th and 6th console generations are my personal favorites, and that's a sentiment I've heard echoed more and more over the years. But why? Why are people yearning for these shorter games? The answer is simple. It's just how human memory works. 2 strong factors in memory are repetition and recency. The games you're more likely to remember are the ones you've either played recently or a lot. Now, let's be honest, if it takes 40 hours to get through a game, chances are that after finishing it, you're only going to pick it back up once in a while. Things might be different if it left a really strong impression on you, but that's not something you can really hinge on in the long run. With this expectation to provide X amount of hours for Y amount of dollars, it really does seem that games have become more one-and-done experiences for a lot of people. But so many of the games that people longingly look back on are meant to be played and replayed. If properly incentivized and crafted, the drive to do better the next time can really drive you to not just play the game a lot, but get more out of it. Really dive deep into the substance the game has and engage with it on a deeper level. These games can get better and better the more you play them. So to divert attention away from that and more towards how long it takes to reach the credits is kind of missing the point. We ask, why don't they make games like they used to before proceeding to be the embodiment of the cause? Now, I can hear some people saying, oh well, the gaming industry is fucked. Just play an indie game. Surely the maddening expectations for presentation value and length don't apply there. Did you forget who you're talking to? No, we are not free from those expectations. It might not be for all of the same reasons, but the indie game market is also completely fucked. True, we might not have to hit the same hour per dollar metrics, but we still have them. It's harder to confidently make a more arcade-style game when you have the funny refunding speedrunners to deal with. We also have an insane expectation for exceptional visuals, but instead of the expectation being photorealistic models, it's people who basically treat indie games less as games, but more so as graphic design portfolios. How long did you spend on this game? 6 years. Nearly worked myself to death by the end of it. Oh, a pity. You're using the wrong shade of red, huh?
I rank thee radioactive dog piss!
Here, learn from my tutorial on the subject. Be thankful I'm even giving this to you. This isn't even a tutorial! One of the things that makes working on video games both really fun and really strenuous is that so many other mediums go into it. It's not the domain for a single skill, it's a playground for all sorts of other skills all coming together, from visual arts and animation, writing, music composition and production, sound effects from synthesized ones to Foley, voice acting, in addition to all of the coding, scripting, and design. You know, the game parts of the game. Any one of those things can be a lot of work, yet you're expected to also compete in this hellish price race to the bottom. Otherwise, people will not buy your game, and even then your chances aren't great. You could hire talent to handle those other things, but if the prospects for getting anything in return are this abysmal, with what money?
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
In case you needed to hear it, most indie games bomb horribly. It's an overcrowded market where it's hard to get noticed. A company like Nintendo could hold a direct close to release and casually drop that a highly anticipated game is coming out the same day as yours, or one indie game in the sea of thousands can go trending and all the attention goes to that and that alone. Say what you will about the traditional game industry, at least those guys have a salary, not just the vain hope for a nickel upon release. Genuinely, making videos on YouTube is more sustainable.
And that's so depressing, I think I'm gonna cry.
Video games are simultaneously a cherished medium and an insanely undervalued one. One where each individual thing put into it has more value than the entire product collectively. Games need to cost nothing, have an immaculate presentation, provide a first-time playthrough of 10 quadrillion hours.
And also, you should win things by watching.
So with the controversy involving stuff like the pricing of Switch 2 games, honestly, from a logical standpoint, I largely don't have an issue with the prices. I think going through what we have here, they make sense. However, I also don't blame people for being upset. For one, the jump is a lot at once. Also, the economy is not in great shape right now, so if people are struggling to get by, they're going to be less willing to spend $80 on a bafflingly mediocre Mario Kart. So while I understand the need to increase prices, I do get the frustration. However, I'd hope to see some deeper reflection as opposed to comparing Nintendo prices to indie games and effectively taking the position of,
ugh, the companies have betrayed me again. Time for me to take the more ethical route by indulging in the fruits of unpaid labor.
That said, it's not like Nintendo hasn't been taking the piss with some of their releases. Like the fucking Virtual Boy shit, are you kidding me? In order to play these games from a vast library of 22, some of which are not likely to be translated over, you need not only the more expensive variant of their subscription service, but this $100 replica of a failed system, which unlike the original, will just be a paperweight after the servers are no longer up. What? Oh, but at least you can get the cardboard version for a mere $25. You see, when I was a kid and I really wanted a GameCube, I took out a sheet of paper, drew on it, cut it out and folded it and made my own paper system so I could pretend to be playing the real one. I think it was at that point where my parents decided to get me one because this was just getting sad, and now Nintendo is selling that to you! Regardless, I think it's pretty clear by now why this series went from multiple paths to a single path. And then when we do the branching paths again, it becomes, oh crap, we need to pad out the runtime. Now, did I cover this series as a way to highlight this phenomena as it impacts the games more and more as time goes on? Yes. However, as easy as it would be to paint the series as a downward slope, as I'm sure plenty others have done, it's really more of a roller coaster ride. Despite a gaming market getting more and more hostile towards this kind of game, the developers Nintendo hired worked their asses off to make these games as good as they could be. In cases like Assault, that effort really shines through, with better rail shooting and all range mode sections than Nintendo could put together. It's easier to miss in something like Zero, but it is definitely there, and when it has a moment that can show it off with no interference, it's magnificent. Really, Nintendo themselves are the weak link here. It's kind of ironic and frankly a bit maddening that whenever people see a flight game less complicated than a full-blown simulator, it all just gets reduced to a Star Fox clone, like this is the gold standard or the true pioneer in this space. When, if anything, I can't think of a series more indicative of Nintendo's weaknesses than this one. From their refusal to iterate and evolve what's there, to their insistence on gimmicks that not only interrupt the core gameplay instead of expand it, but also anchor these games built for replayability to their platforms and preventing them from being re-released in the future. In gaming culture, we tend to be taught the Super Smash Bros. Version of video game history. And even beyond that, the retro games people tend to care about are the ones in franchises that are still running. I think that's a huge part of why fan bases around things like Star Fox can get so defensive and push so hard for new games. They want them to still be important. However, that desire for importance and validation can often lead to creating false narratives and erasing not just other games, but the work that led to the thing that they love in the first place. It's not that Nintendo doesn't deserve credit for their accomplishments, but they all too often get the credit for things they didn't do or inventing things they didn't invent.
And while we're at it, hey, let's steal from F-Zero too.
Dude, that's Stun Runner.
How about we just punch the hell out of people too? I mean, let's not monkey around this time.
Fellas, stop! Don't you realize you're ripping off Donkey Kong? Now, Nintendo does promote other developers on their platforms.
We also have needs for other kinds of games, ones that appeal to every kind of gamer and every kind of taste. For these, we are turning aggressively to our great third-party partners.
God, I miss this man. And that sentiment.
The talented designers at LucasArts have given us a beautiful exclusive, Rebel Strike. And the same talented people at Factor 5.
However, when it comes to the games that they make internally, you don't usually hear about what games inspired them. This can give the impression that they sprung fully formed from Miyamoto's brow to people all too willing to believe that.
If you could arrest video games for theft, I'd be giving this thing 18 to life.
Problem with those narratives, as we've seen in this video, is that they fall apart simply by playing games outside of the Nintendo bubble. This was something I always loved about the Rogue Squadron games because they were not afraid to tell you their inspirations or whom they wished to pay tribute to.
Well, I guess you'd call this our tribute to Jeff Minter and Tempest 2000.
Yeah, actually, I sat down with Julian and we came up with a really rough design that was inspired by some things we'd seen in some science fiction movies that we liked.
Hell, in Rebel Strike, they weren't just going to tell you about them, they included them on the disc!
Finally, what I'm sitting in here is a 1983 cockpit version of Star Wars Arcade, which incidentally was the original inspiration for the Rogue Squadron series. To make it possible for you to experience this original arcade game, if you're a pretty good player, then you can unlock it in the bonus section of Rebel Strike.
This didn't make me respect Factor 5 any less. If anything, it only made me respect them more. Seeing what they took and how they built off of it in real time was really cool. We got to see their love not just for the IP they were working with, but the medium itself. As a kid, this is what inspired me to make games and helped spark that curiosity to really dig into this medium and see what could inspire me. So it saddens me to see people look for reasons to limit their horizons and for what games people play to reduce more and more to just what other people are already talking about, whether it's a AAA game, indie game, or even retro game. It's just FOMO. A game being trending or relevant shouldn't be the deciding factor in whether or not it's kept in the history books. Especially when Nintendo keeps shutting down ROM websites. People complain about this through the lens of not selling the Nintendo games they're taking down, which is a fair point, but I think people forget. It's not just Nintendo games that get removed when a ROM site dies. Not every person or company that made games in the past can sell their old work, so to reduce everything to their original copies, leaving some games on formats with preservation issues, we risk losing those games forever. I could sit here and talk about what Nintendo can do with Star Fox,
I could state the obvious and say that they should try making a game with branching paths and good rail shooting without anything in the way this time. I could express my bafflement that they've never made a Star Fox arcade game when other properties like Mario Kart, F-Zero, Cruisin', and even Luigi's Mansion got them. Hell, that would probably be a good way to justify the former before porting it back to consoles, and if anyone complains it's too short, well, it's an arcade game. What did he expect?
Oh my god. They need to become meat.
However, with how this video devolved into how our own closed-mindedness can not only hurt the properties we love, but also erase everything else, I feel it's more appropriate to recommend other games that if you like Star Fox, you might also enjoy. For starters, I can't talk about classic flight rail shooters and not bring up Sega. They've made a lot of really good ones. Space Harrier and Galaxy Force in particular would be good fits here. If you want something with branching paths and objectives, albeit not on the same scale, Afterburner Climax is a good time. If you're looking for wide maps with tons of alternate routes and optional tunnel sections, Total Eclipse for the 3DO is another I've had a lot of fun with. I feel that the collision box on your ship is a little too vertical, and this can create a bit of a learning curve with tight squeezes, but otherwise this is a fast-paced and frenetic shooter with some excellent music. People who say the Sega CD is nothing but FMV games clearly haven't tried Core Design's output on the thing. Soulstar is a great shooter on the system, with good set pieces, gorgeous sprite work, and some genuinely good music. It even has all range sections even before Star Fox 2. In fact, the lead on the project, Sarah Jane Avery, is making indie games for old platforms like the Commodore 64 and is currently experimenting with the Spectrum Next. So give her itch.io page a look. Galaga Destination Earth on PlayStation is pretty neat. It switches between the original top-down perspective to a side-scrolling shmup to a full-on rail shooter, which is something you really don't see that often, and it's welcome here. I personally get quite the kick out of Iridian 3D on Game Boy Advance. I've heard people complain about depth perception, but honestly, considering how many of the games in this genre are pseudo 3D, this won't be anything unfamiliar by now, and the game honestly does a fine job with Vanishing Point and general perspective. Plus, it has an outstanding soundtrack by Manfred Linsner. Obviously, I'm going to recommend the Rogue Squadron trilogy and Battlefront a boot if you haven't already played them. Emulating them is a pain, so I'd look for an original copy. Thankfully, they're among the more affordable classics on their consoles, so don't pass them up. I'd also recommend Crimson Skies on Xbox, which in many ways is quite like Rogue Squadron but with a more sandbox-style mission structure. Frankly, if Nintendo went all in on open landscape-driven flight for Star Fox, I think this would be a decent reference point for it. It definitely played to their strengths. There are plenty more out there. I'm really just scratching the surface here, so go nuts and feel free to mention other flight games in the comment section. Well, that ended up being bleaker than I anticipated. I know, I'll play a new game. What's Pac-Man up to? Oh no, I'm the Pac-Man 100% girl. Surely I'm not stupid enough to— Yes, I 100% completed it! Now you all know my shame! Oh well, did they outsource anything good this year?
Y'all ready for an encore? Yeah!
Congrats, Nintendo. You're not the only company that has this weird issue. I would very much like to thank my patrons who have been very patient with me, as this video has taken quite a long time to make. You'd think that'd be a good time to self-promote a little, but I'm terrible at that, so here's the spirit of YouTube.
In the spirit of YouTube, remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell before jumping into an active volcano!
Don't do that.